Good morning, and welcome to the wonderful New American Review show today. We're happy to have our co-host today, Orion Marler, with us. Good morning, Orion.
Good morning, Paul.
And then we've got our, I guess we call you our expert or our professional guest. This is Joe Wolverton. Joe is a constitutional attorney, and he also is a regular contributor to the New American magazine, and that is what this show is. This is about the New American magazine. It's the review of the magazine and the information that we find there, and it's all about limiting government and getting back to the Founding Fathers' idea of what the Constitution is and what it means. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Paul. Thank you for having me on.
You've got a great radio voice. I'm the only one here that doesn't. Ryan and you have these great radio voices.
I've got a radio face, too. So,
well, we're happy to have you all here this morning, folks. And Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're from the Memphis area in Tennessee originally, and then you came up and went to Brigham Young University
yes,
for
sir.
your undergrad, and then you went back to Memphis for your law degree.
That's correct. Yep, from the Memphis area originally. Family lived there for a long, long time, and then I went to Brigham Young for my undergrad, poli-sci, studied the Republic under Dr. Dick Vetterli.
Now, I think it's interesting that you didn't say our democracy. Now, why would you prefer the term our republic, the correct term, and you obviously know the difference?
Well, I prefer the term republic because that's the phrase that the founders used to describe our government. And as a student of representative government from Greece forward, I can tell you that we definitely have a republican form of government. That is, the people rule through elected representatives, and the law is sovereign under the people, as opposed to the mass of the people being the sovereign. We are not a majority rule entity at all. We are ruled under law and under representatives, and so we are a republic.
And as a matter of fact, I think that a democracy is, I've heard, two wolves and a sheep voting on what is for dinner.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Orion, how are you doing over there this morning?
Oh, I'm doing good. Appreciate being here with Joe.
Yeah, it's
morning,
an honor.
Joe.
It's an honor, Joe, to be with you this morning. Joe, tell me a little bit about what motivated you to study constitutional law.
Well, I'll tell you the quick version of the story. When I was a freshman at BYU, I lived in Hinckley Hall there at Helaman Halls, and one of my roommates there was a member of the John Birch Society. And to just give you a little bit of backstory, the doctor who assisted in my birth was a member of the John Birch Society, so the first human hands that ever touched me were Bircher hands. And so freshman year, I was introduced to the Blue Book, the John Birch Society Blue Book, by my good friend there, and just took to it. It spoke to me and resonated with me from my study of the gospel. It resonated with that, and I recognized that the Spirit of God is the Spirit of freedom, and from there on, I was hooked and began studying the Federalist Papers a lot, and just took to it and knew that there was a need to expose hidden works of darkness and to get this country back on its constitutional moorings. And so that's what I've been doing ever since.
Well, I want to alert our viewers and our listeners that on our website, UtahTalkRadio.com, that's UtahTalkRadio.com, there not only is there links for you to be able to listen live on the radio, but there's also links for you to view this live. And we are on Google Hangouts, and we are also broadcasting live on YouTube. Now, on our website, if you go part way down on the right column, there's a link to this show that tells about what the show is. And there, if you click on that link, it takes you to the page of the New American Review. And on that page, there is a lot of information available. There's a place to show where you can sign up for the New American magazine, and that comes both in a printed and an internet format. Is that not correct?
Yes, sir. I'm surprised by how many people that subscribe to the magazine aren't aware that on the website at thenewamerican.com, we have a good 10 articles posted every day, fresh articles that don't appear in the magazine that cover breaking news and current events as they happen. So I always, at the speeches I give, I always mention, please go to thenewamerican.com. Make sure you put "the" in front of it, thenewamerican.com, and get the information you need to make some differences in the country. And like I say, it's roughly 10 fresh articles every day.
And as a matter of fact, if you go to our website and you link on to the New American Review show, right there it will give a link to Joe Wolverton. He has his own biography page, his own bio on the website, and we've included about maybe 20 of your most recent articles that you've written, and we've even got a couple of, at least one or more of your YouTube videos that show some of the speeches you've given and some of the information available there. But you also have a biography page on thenewamerican.com,
right,
which provides information not only about you, but if you search your name, it brings up many of the articles you've written through the years about this nation, the Constitution, what we are, and what we should become.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you a couple of questions
Sure.
About some things that happened late last week. One is Representative Amash, his amendment to limit the powers or limit this illegal searching that is going on by the NSA. And unfortunately, that went down in defeat. Can you give us a little bit of information on that?
Sure. It was a defense appropriations bill that was working its way through the House, and Justin Amash of Michigan, a consistent constitutionalist, one of the best young congressmen on Capitol Hill, was able to get an amendment attached to the defense appropriation bill that would have required the NSA to stop the wholesale dragnet confiscation and surveillance of phone records, as they have been doing, which and by some miracle, the amendment actually made it to the House floor, where it was defeated, 205 in favor, 217 against. The most important thing, of course, beside the fact that it would have done something, some little something, but at least something to curtail the immense power of the federal government to monitor our lives unconstitutionally. The most telling aspect of the tale was the fact that a majority of Republicans voted against the amendment, and a majority of Democrats voted for the amendment, which a vote against the amendment, just to be clear, is a vote to extend the power of the NSA to continue its unconstitutional surveillance of innocent Americans.
Including the Speaker of the House, Boehner, he voted for it, and ISA, and you even had Paul Ryan, former vice presidential candidate, voting to limit, rather to expand or to continue the surveillance upon the private lives of American citizens.
Absolutely. It was it's nearly an unwritten rule in the House of Representatives, fellas, that the Speaker of the House does not vote on legislation unless it's absolutely required. In this case, Speaker Boehner not only voted against Representative Amash's amendment, but he issued a statement after his vote saying, essentially, in no uncertain terms, that a vote in favor of the Amash amendment would have been a vote in favor of terrorism.
Okay, well, we're going to have to pick this up after the break. We're up to a hard break, and we'll continue with this topic for a while in the next segment. Glad to have you here, folks, here on KHQN 1480 on the New American Review. Are we still live on...
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
Welcome back to the New American Review here on KHQN 1480, UtahTalkRadio.com, broadcasting to you live from Provo, Utah, but broadcasting worldwide via the Internet, the YouTube, and Google Hangouts. Folks, if you have any questions or comments for our guest today, you can call us toll-free on 1-800-776-1913. That's 1-800-776-1913. And by the way, that 776 reminds us of of the Declaration of Independence, but unfortunately the 1913 reminds us of several unfortunate events that took place in this nation.
Absolutely.
Good to have you with us here, Orion, our co-host on the show, and also our expert guest, Joe Wolverton from the New American Review. Well, from the New American, and then we have him here on the New American Review. Orion, do you have any questions that have come up in your mind so far?
Well, a couple of questions. Number one, how does someone subscribe to this New American Review? And then the next question is, where do we go from here? How can we help with this deterioration of the Constitution?
You know, that's the question we get more than anything else. Anything else on the show is, what can we do? We feel so helpless. Is there anything we can do as just ordinary run-of-the-mill citizens in this nation to try to get something done to stop this steamroller that's going over us? Now, the first question you ask, Orion, is how do you subscribe to the New American? And so can you give an answer to that, Joe? How do people subscribe to the New American?
I think the best way to subscribe and the best deals are found on the website at thenewamerican.com. And there's a link there to subscribe, and they usually have a really good deal. That's the best way. And, of course, once you subscribe, then you'll be getting to the custom of looking every day online and seeing the new stories that come out. That's so important. And so that's the best way to subscribe. Now, as to the second part of the question of what we can do, that's the question I'm asked most. I do speeches probably 10 a month, and that's the question everybody has at the end is, what can we do? That's all fine and good, but what can we do? And I think the first step and the most important step is educate yourself. If you want to defend that which the Founding Fathers established, you have to understand what they understood. And I've written several articles, and I try constantly in my speeches to point people toward the fountain of wisdom from which our Founding Fathers drank. It's a deep well and sweet water. If we can discover the timeless principles of liberty that they relied on when they established our government. You know, you have critics that'll show up in my speeches and say, well, you know, something written in 1787 is outdated. You know, they couldn't have foreseen the things that we are experiencing. And I agree with them that they could not have foreseen that. But, of course, the principles set forth in the Constitution were outdated in 1787. These are principles that are timeless, that are eternal principles of liberty, that these great noble men drew upon from their study of history and knew that these were, you know, they, as I often say, I'm an analogy fan, and I often say they were coroners, and they inspected the lifeless body of republics of the past and found out what the disease was that killed them and made sure they inoculated the United States against that disease.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And, you know, folks, I don't hesitate at all to add to that, and I think you don't hesitate, either one of you either, and that is these men weren't just extraordinary men, they were inspired. They were inspired by their maker to put together this great contract called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I think it's amazing how they drew on their own experience, their own knowledge, their own reading, and then also were giving that extra oomph of inspiration to put together three separate entities within the government that were supposed to have checks and balances between the three branches of government, but something has happened there, and we've got something going on by a group of Gadiantons or whatever who are trying to bring us to to something that has been proven over and over again to fail. And why do they keep pursuing this when they know it's failed in every single instance that has been tried in this world?
Do you think that another one of the problems is ignorance of the people? I think most people don't understand the Constitution. Most people don't study it unless they go to a college where they teach such a thing, and then we've got professors that are so liberal they don't get the real meaning of what the Constitution really is.
Well, I remember when they used to teach it in school, when in elementary school and junior high and high school, and it's now brushed over. Obviously, we've got some educational engineering going on. What do you think, Joe? You're the expert here. Tell us what is the answer? And you are absolutely right. Education certainly is the first step, but it's the right kind of education. Where do they find that education?
Well, absolutely. I am amazed at speeches when I reference the Federalist Papers and no one's ever read them. I am a former professor of government at a university there in Tennessee, and my students, many of them, signed up for Political Science 101 that I taught, and had never heard of the Federalist Papers. And I can't really say that I was shocked in the fact that I went to law school and took constitutional law for a year, and we never once opened the Constitution. We read decisions, Supreme Court decisions that ostensibly defined the Constitution, but we never read a single line from that document. And that's the case all over the country. There's not a constitutional lawyer in this country who can say in law school they ever read the Constitution. So that's the first step. Get to know what's in. Look, take 30 minutes out of your television watching day and read the Constitution. It won't take you that long, and then set yourself a course for reading the things that the founders read. And you will discover that they really were, as you said, so rightly said, they were the best blood of the 18th century, there's no doubt.
And, I will say that as far as the Federalist Papers are concerned, there were a lot of Americans after the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. A lot of people had questions. What have you gotten us into? And there was a lot going on at the time, like there is now. People were unfamiliar with what was happening, and so John Jay and others got together and said, hey, let's write some opinions and let's educate the public of what's going on. And that's how we got the Federalist Papers. And I believe that if people study the Federalist Papers, they will see the intent of our founding fathers. Well, as some of the people in our modern society have said, well, so what does it matter? These old men who are not even relevant to today's issues. Why should we read the Federalist Papers? Why should we read the Bill of Rights? Why should we read the Constitution and become familiar with what it means?
Well, by that standard, why do we read the Bible?
Exactly, and that's what they say too. That's outdated.
Yeah,
as well.
Absolutely. But I say it's the same principle with the Scriptures, and the same principle with the Federalist Papers. It's timeless. They're eternal principles of freedom that these men understood, and we would do ourselves a kindness. And I tell you, I teach a class for high school students on the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers. I'd say there's as much to be learned from the Anti-Federalist Papers as there are from the Federalist Papers. These men were noble and educated as well, and you've got people as enlightened as Patrick Henry who were opposed to the Constitution. And when you read, you'd be surprised, when you read the Anti-Federalist Papers, those men proved just as prophetic as the authors of the Federalists. The authors of the Federalists were very optimistic that we'd be able to preserve freedom, whereas the Anti-Federalists thought there's no way that this will, eventually devolve into a tyranny, and they were right in many cases. In many cases they were wrong, but in many cases they were right. So I think a two-channel, a stereo, if you will, a stereo input of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, studying them both and really coming to understand exactly like you said, Paul, what the founders intended. It matters a lot what they intended, because once you start that study, you understand just how far we've come from that the foundation that we were placed upon.
Well, okay. I've got to shift gears a little bit. We're running a little bit behind. Doesn't matter. We're discussing important things, and whether we get them all in according to the schedule or not, we always have another day. But I have a question about something that happened late Friday.
Sure.
The House Committee approved a funding ban. A House Committee approved a funding ban on the UN gun grab. And it looks like they're trying to do an end run on the Constitution by making us subservient to the United Nations. And by this, the United Nations have come with this gun control legislation. And then if they can get the United States to sign on to that, they don't need to worry about the constitutionality or our Second Amendment, as all they have to do is just implement the United Nations regulations and then make us subservient to those. What is this House Committee funding where they actually approved a funding ban on the UN arms, the gun grab?
Right. Representative Mike Kelly, a Republican from Pennsylvania, added an amendment to the State Foreign Operations and Related Programs Appropriation Bill for fiscal year 2014, and the amendment that he sponsored included a one-year funding ban on the use of federal money to implement the Arms Trade Treaty, the ATT it's called, the Arms Trade Treaty, the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. So for 1 year, should this ultimately pass the House and the Senate and be signed by the President, the State Department would be prohibited from using any federal funds to implement the Arms Trade Treaty. Now, back in March, I was sent by the John Birch Society to represent us and to cover the Arms Trade Treaty Conference in the UN headquarters in New York City. And I'll tell you, when people think that no one's listening, the things they say are remarkable. I speak Spanish, having served a mission for the LDS Church in Mexico City, and I was invited by the ambassador of Spain to speak at one of the conferences, one of the mini conferences at that conference. And I was the lone voice crying in the wilderness, for sure, as far as the God-given right to keep and bear arms and defend oneself. And mind you, just parenthetically, that's defend oneself from the tyranny of government, not from intruders, although it includes both. The Founding Fathers understood that the principles behind the Second Amendment were intended to protect us from tyranny, not from thieves. But anyway, so at that conference, the ideas that were floated were astounding to me. That standing there in the belly of the beast in Manhattan, these people began discussing ways to circumvent the Second Amendment. They began discussing ways to first remove ammunition from Americans and second remove their arms, because a gun without a bullet is just a club, and they know that.
Exactly. Well, we're down to 41 seconds, and folks, what we're going to discuss in the next segment or two, we're going to talk about the NDAA. And we're getting an update and a commentary on what the NDAA is. A lot of the people may know that and may need to be educating you on that. Segment 3, we're going to try to get into the UN Arms Trade Treaty. And then if we have time, we want to talk about the state efforts to nullify. We're glad to have you with us. If you need to talk to us, call us at 1-800-776-1913. That's 1-800-776-1913 here on KHQN 1480. Welcome back to KHQN 1480, UtahTalkRadio.com. We're glad to have you join us this morning on the New American Review. We're broadcasting live from Provo, Utah. We're broadcasting on YouTube Live and also on Google Hangouts, as well as celestially on the radio. We're glad to have all of you join us and listen to this wonderful new program that is going to provide you with information to hopefully try to save this great republic of ours. We've got our co-host this morning, Orion Marler. Glad to have you here.
Oh, good to be here.
And our expert guest, we have Joe Wolverton, who is a constitutional attorney, and he is a regular contributing author to the New American magazine. And if you want to subscribe to that magazine, go to thenewamerican.com. That's thenewamerican.com, and you can subscribe from there. If you go to our website, utahtalkradio.com, you can do the same by scrolling down the page to the New American Review. Click on that, and you can go in and subscribe from there, as well as join the JBS if you prefer, and as well as you can link to your page, Joe, and that page is Joe Wolverton, and it tells a lot about you, your life, a little bit of a biography on you, and many of the articles you've written. So you can link on those and read all of your incredible wisdom. Before the break, we talked about the NDAA, and we're going to do a little bit of an update on that and where that's going. What does NDAA stand for?
NDAA stands for the National Defense Authorization Act, and it is an annual bill that funds a lot of the Pentagon programs. It's nothing new. They've been an NDAA for years and years, and typically it's voted through without much discussion, because who wants to stand up against defense spending, right? Especially people with an R after their name. But in 2011, the game changed a little bit in that in the 2011 version, that which was be in force for fiscal year 2012, included a provision, the infamous Section 1021, that empowered the president with the sole power, the autocratic power, to deploy United States military troops inside the United States to apprehend and then indefinitely detain in a federal prison any American citizen that he alone suspected of posing a military threat to the United States.
Scary, scary. Now, what does that do with posse comitatus?
Well, it completely is a de facto repeal of the Posse Comitatus Act. Absolutely. It's also a repeal of the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, because the Fourth Amendment, of course, says that you cannot be deprived of your life or liberty without due process of law, and the Fifth Amendment the same, and then the Sixth Amendment says that you have a right to an attorney. However, the NDAA, and it's been repeated now and reapproved twice, and it's about to be reapproved again, maintains that provision, and famously Senator Lindsey Graham on the floor of the Senate, a Republican, I might add, famously said that when asked what would happen if an American citizen was detained under the NDAA, why they would not be permitted to consult with an attorney, he said famously, "Sit down and shut up, you don't get an attorney."
Yes, and wasn't it our infamous former speaker who, well, no, it wasn't, it was a Dianne Feinstein who said that all veterans are crazy. I mean,
she did, and not only that, but I've covered in the New American, and something that doesn't unfortunately get enough, as the son of a retired Army sergeant. I can tell you I grew up my whole life in the Army. My father was in the Army for 24 years. I recognize what an offense to those who have served this country that was. They have passed many bills, and they've only begun recently implementing it, Paul, where they will require veterans, before they get a permit to own a weapon, they will require these veterans to undergo psychological counseling, and they routinely refuse weapons permits to veterans under this guise that they're all crazy and threats. And of course, famously in 2009, the Department of Homeland Security issued their famous white paper wherein they declared that any people who are members of these so-called liberty groups are nothing more than homegrown terrorists and should be treated as such.
And they've included Christians in much of their language.
Absolutely.
So I guess if you're a Christian, you are a member of a terrorist group.
Yeah, I'm one of those crazy people, former Marine.
Oh my goodness! See, there you go. You've got the triple threat.
You better be careful sitting next to me.
That's right. You're a veteran. You're a member of a liberty organization. And you're a Christian. You're.
I even have a gun permit, by the way.
Look at that.
Well, folks, listen. This NDAA is so dangerous to your freedoms. They can illegally, unconstitutionally, we should say, because now they're giving the cover of legality to it, can detain you in an undetermined amount of time in a facility, loss of freedom without attorneys, without any of our rights that were guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights. They now can hold you, can they not, Joe, as long as they want. So I guess maybe there's something to these FEMA camp rumors after all. If they're going to put people in there and just throw away the key, sure seems like that goes against what our founding fathers had in mind for the citizens of this country.
Absolutely. And just to make it clear, the Fourth Amendment, of course, is not due process. The Fourth Amendment is your right, your protection against search and seizure without a warrant or without probable cause. The Fifth Amendment is your right to not be deprived of life, liberty, without due process of law.
And also the right to not incriminate yourself.
Absolutely.
You can keep silent, and it can't be held against you.
Except for the case of the latest Supreme Court case that I covered, that probably was the most popular article I've written in the last few months. The Supreme Court now has said you do not have the right to remain silent. The fact that you remain silent can be used in court as evidence of your guilt.
Scary stuff. All right, so what is an update on this? Where are we going with this? What about, it's up for renewal here soon, and it's going to be voted on whether or not we're going to go into, and I know there's some opposition against that now, and people are starting to wake up and say, hey, wait a minute. Do we know how our politicians feel about this from Utah? Are Utah politicians? I can tell you that Senator Mike Lee is dead set against it. Senator Orrin Hatch is dead set in favor of extending the NDAA for another year. Now look, and the problem with the NDAA is that many of the provisions therein are harmless, are necessary. You know, one of the constitutional powers of the federal government is national defense, and no one would argue against that. It's
it's these more pernicious sections that still remain. Despite the opposition, the president is still in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, still empowered in his sole discretion to send military troops to arrest and indefinitely detain American citizens that he alone suspects of threatening the establishment. Now, Senator Lee is against it. Senator Hatch is in favor of it. Jason Chaffetz is against it. But when the rubber hits the road, who knows how people are going to vote.
How do they separate the fact that Congress is the one who has to declare war and the difference between that and what the president does?
Well, they long ago have surrendered that right. They now consider the president, and it's called the unitary executive is what they call it. They have surrendered the right to declare war. They've surrendered their right to check the executive. They've surrendered their right to check the judiciary, and we're left with an all-powerful president and an all-powerful judiciary and an impotent Congress who sees themselves nothing more as a rubber stamp for the latest betrayal of individual liberties.
All right, that's an update that we could talk about for 3 straight days.
Absolutely.
But I would like to get into something quickly before we enter into our next segment. And as I want to talk about, and these all segue one into the other. So the UN Arms Trade Treaty, what is that? Where are we going with that? What is that trying to do? What freedoms is that putting in jeopardy?
Along with the NDAA, I would say this arms trade treaty is one of the biggest threats to individual liberty that we've seen in 50 years. The Arms Trade Treaty, as I said, I covered this conference in March down in Manhattan, in the belly of the beast, as I call it. And the Arms Trade Treaty now has been passed. I was sitting there and talking to the Undersecretary of State there in New York, and the word came down that President Obama had given the green light. The United States was to vote in favor of it, and they did ultimately vote in favor of it, in favor of the Arms Trade Treaty. I will tell you that there are many sections of that United Nations gun grab that should frighten Americans. And first it should frighten you, but then it should get you angry enough to do something. We've got civilians are absolutely prohibited under terms of this treaty from owning, buying, selling, or transferring arms or ammunition. It gives a monopoly of control over ammunition and weapons to what they call authorized state parties, which means governments. Now, the part that is the most revealing in this is that, they claim the Arms Trade Treaty claims to be a way to prevent violence. But of course, as I've said, the murders committed by all the serial killers in all the history of the world do not amount to a fraction of the killings committed by these authorized state parties. There were, in the 20th century alone, over 300 million people killed by authorized state parties, the very parties that will now be given a monopoly of control over arms and ammunition. That's one of the most frightening things. Certainly another frightening aspect is the article that requires that the United States and all participating nations keep a control list, that is to say, a list of everyone who owns guns and ammunition. Their first step toward disarmament of civilians is to take away your ammunition, because they know that without ammo, a gun is just a club.
Yep.
And that's their first step.
So they couldn't get the gun ban, but they're going to now work on the ammunition. And so maybe everyone needs to get their own little reloaders. I don't know.
Well, I can tell you about that, too, when we come back, if you'd like.
All right, well, we're to a hard break. We're glad to have you with us here this morning on the New American Review on KHQN 1480. Okay, we're still live, so tell me. Welcome back, folks. We're here live with you at KHQN 1480. UtahTalkRadio.com is streaming to you live on YouTube and Google Hangouts. We're glad to have you with us this morning, Orion, our co-host.
Okay, Paul.
And then we also have our expert guest who is also our expert witness. We've got
a hostile witness.
Constitutional law professor, constitutional law attorney, and professor. This is Mr. Joe Wolverton. We're glad to have you here live with us this morning, Joe. It's a pleasure, and we're grateful for your knowledge and your compassion and your adamancy about what this means for our nation. Joe, I have a question, and that is, okay, we've got these things happen. We've got the UN Arms Trade Treaty that Obama asked the United Nations representative to approve, which he did, and now this is apparently going to affect us in some way. What can we do? What can we as ordinary citizens do? Education is one thing. What else is there that we can do to fight this intrusion upon our rights?
Well, I think the education, as you said, is the first thing. It needs to be directed education. Education in the principles of liberty upon which our Constitution is founded. You know, Jack McManus is famous for saying there are no constitutional rights. There are rights protected by the Constitution. And that's true. The Constitution is not the source of our rights. God is the source of our rights.
Right. Inalienable rights, or if you're in another part of the country, unalienable rights.
Unalienable, inalienable, as long as they're not alienated. That's all that matters.
So these rights are from God, and they're spelled out and identified by the United States Constitution. And these rights which come from God are being eclipsed by a group of people who are interested in having control and power and money and whatever it is that's providing them their goodies and gimmies. But what can we do?
Well, the first thing I think we need to do is realize something that the Founding Fathers realized and fought for, and that is to maintain the states as bastions of liberty. I think, unfortunately, the states have become nothing more than subsidiaries of the federal government, and that is the opposite of the true relation of those two powers. The states created the federal government. The federal government did not create the states, and thus the states have power to control the federal government when it exceeds its constitutional boundaries. As I'm fond of saying, the states are responsible for forcing the federal beast out back inside the constitutional cage.
Well, now, Joe, let me say that you're a constitutionalist. You've studied it. You know it. What rights does the federal government have, and what are reserved for the states and the people?
Well, as James Madison famously said in Federalist Number 45, the rights of the federal government are few and defined. They are defined in the terms of the Constitution. The Constitution is the contract entered in by the states. As part of that contract, the federal government was created. It is an agent of the state governments, indeed. This contract created a principal-agent relationship. And so if there is, it's not to say that the federal government cannot do this or cannot do that. The only things that it can do are those things specifically and explicitly assigned to it by the states in the Constitution, which is the contract that created it in the first place. So that's not to say, well, there's nothing, the congressmen and senators are famous for saying, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we can't do this. Well, that's looking at it through the wrong end of the lens. What we need to understand is you cannot, that is to say the federal government cannot do anything unless that power is specifically granted to it in the Constitution. The saying that I love to repeat is the Constitution, every time, every issue, no exceptions.
Okay, and so anything that is not specifically stated as granting certain powers to the federal government are reserved for the state or for the individual, and that's actually stated in the Constitution, is it not? That's
right. In the 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment says that if a power is not specifically granted to the federal government, it is reserved to the people and to the states respectively. But as James Madison himself was famous for saying, we shouldn't need a 10th Amendment, because it's self-evident that if a power isn't granted to the federal government, it's reserved to the states, because the states created the federal government.
Well, as a matter of fact, some of the founding fathers says, hey, we don't need any amendments. because it is already stated what they're allowed and not allowed to do. And some of the founding fathers wisely said, wait a minute, I don't care if you say that. We want a few certain specific items mentioned, and that's how we got the amendments.
Absolutely. Alexander Hamilton, even in the Federalist Papers, argued, and I think it's Federalist number 78, argued that we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights because to put it in modern parlance, he said, for example, Paul, if I said to you, I'm giving you the power in this contract to tell me what color tie I can wear, then I shouldn't have to put in some separate amendment saying you couldn't tell me what color car to drive. That was his argument, and it's a sound argument. Unfortunately, and in this, the Anti-Federalists were right. That's all fine and good for people that are holy, for people that are dedicated to principles of liberty, but we're going to have a generation of men, and we've had several generations now rise up who are in love with power and will not be bound by traditional concepts of individual freedom.
And the problem is they are always looking for ways to get around the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And it's almost like they don't even care anymore. It's just an open attack. It's before it was covert, and now it's just a complete overt open attack on the Constitution, or just it's an unimportant, irrelevant document. I've heard that so many times now.
Well, President Obama famously said that himself in 2007, that the Constitution was irrelevant and outdated, and he acts as if he believes it. But unfortunately, as we said at the top of the show, so do most Republicans now. I mean, we had majority Republicans voting against the Amash Amendment, voting in favor.
That's just amazing to me. Well, let's talk about something that came up. This segues naturally into it, and that is, what can states themselves do to nullify these attempts to eliminate the Constitution?
Well, let's define something, because the other night in a speech I was speaking to a group of liberty-minded Americans, and I think 3 out of the whole crowd knew what nullification was. Nullification recognizes that the states possess the right to hold as null, void, and of no legal effect any federal act that exceeds the few and defined powers given to it in the Constitution. States, as creators of the federal government, maintain the right to disregard and refuse to enforce any federal act that exceeds the constitutional powers granted to it. And I think that's the reason we need to turn to states. This is the number one response I give to everyone who asks, what can we do? Turn your states into bastions of liberty. Turn them into bulwarks of liberty. Make them magnets to people that love liberty. And nullify, that is to say, disregard and hold as null, void, and no legal effect all unconstitutional acts of the federal government. And that is our right. And if you don't mind, I'll give you an analogy that I use when I teach people about nullification. It's suppose, and many of you may have had this experience, you hire someone to build a home for you, a contractor, and you enter into a contract with that contractor, and you tell him, I want a 2,000 square foot home, I want 3 bedrooms, and I want 2 bathrooms, and you leave the site and you trust him to build it, and you come back and there's a swimming pool in the backyard. And he hands you a bill for the swimming pool. Well, who's going to pay that bill? I'm certainly not. I'm going to point him to the contract and say, look here, brother, there is not a provision in this contract for you to build and charge me for a swimming pool. And, however, when it comes to the price of the house, if he's confined himself to the contract, well, I'm obligated to pay for that house the way we contracted. But I'm not obligated to pay for things that he does that exceed that contract. But for some reason, for decades now, we have continued paying for the swimming pools being dug by the federal government. We continue paying for the programs and projects that they come up with that not only deny us of our liberty, but charge us for the privilege. And I do not understand why, as citizens and as state legislators, more of us are not standing up to the federal government and saying, here's the line, you can't cross it, and if you decide to cross it, well, we're going to hold as null and void anything you say, because you just can't exceed the contract.
Well, and one of the problems we have is that the federal government has usurped a lot of the money through taxation of the citizens of the states, and they can withhold payments and other monies to hurt states. I remember we were talking, I think it's 30-something% of the budget to run the state government here in Utah is paid for by the
That's
federal
right.
government. And so they can say, well, we're not going to give you that money if you don't stick with her. They've already done that before in several instances. So what can we do there? And we've only got a minute and a half left.
Well, I have testified up at Salt Lake City before in the legislature, and I can tell you we have trouble in Salt Lake City. It starts with T and it rhymes with P and it stands for tyranny, to quote the Music Man. But you have Republicans up there on Capitol Hill in Salt Lake City who have surrendered the fight, Democrats as well. And I would say if Governor Herbert, for example, were serious about standing up against federal tyranny, he would tear up that check that comes in from the federal government every month, and we would start living according to our means, the same way we do for our families. You're supposed to stay out of debt. Well, our states should start to stay out of debt and refuse to take the bribe money that comes in from Washington. We have to remember they've got a printing press over there. They can print all the money they want and pay for your servitude. And we need a group of strong, constitutionally liberty-minded legislators, state legislators, who will stand up, tear up those checks, live according to our means, and enforce strictly the powers of the Constitution and the restrictions thereon.
Well, it's been good to have you with us here today, folks. We are very impressed with the information that we're able to give you from the John Birch Society, from the New American, and we are here today on the New American Review on KHQN 1480, and we will see you again next week at the same time at 8 o'clock on next Monday. Glad to have you here, Joe.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.